Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for CBC's Booked at VPL with Lisa Bird-Wilson. My name is Jonna, and I'd like to begin this morning by acknowledging that my home and VPL locations are located on the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. When we acknowledge the land, we hope it's an opportunity for all of us to really reflect on the ongoing history of colonialism in our country and consider ways that we can further incorporate anti-racism and decolonization into improving our communities. To find out whose land you're watching from, please follow the link in the chat to Whose Land. Without further ado, I'd like to pass things over to Sheryl MacKay, host of CBC's North by Northwest, who is here to chat with Lisa Bird-Wilson about her wonderful book, Probably Ruby. Good morning and welcome to Sheryl and Lisa.
Good morning, Jonna. Thank you so much. Good morning, Lisa. There you are. Hello.
Dan said good morning. I really missed my cue there.
And Lisa, where are you?
I'm in Saskatoon on Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis Nation.
Thank you. It's so great to have you here. And for people who haven't met you yet or haven't had a chance to read your wonderful book, I'll just tell them that Lisa Bird-Wilson is an author, a poet, a short story writer, a novelist, and we're here to talk about her latest book, which is Probably Ruby. And Lisa is a Cree and Métis writer, and as she said, based in Saskatchewan. Lisa, this book, let me just start by saying this book is amazing. I don't know that I've ever read a book quite like this one. It's so powerful and so beautiful. And I bet you've been hearing that a lot.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you so much for saying that. And also thank you for, having me on this program and with the Vancouver Public Library. It's really wonderful to be here and join you from my home. And this is my office in Saskatoon.
Now we're all peeking at your office.
Yes, I've tried to put, those are the only copies of my book I have left. So they're all there. So as they go, it'll, just whittle down. Yeah, I've heard I've had various feedback about my book, and I'll be really honest. I'll say some people say what you said. It's very different. It's very unusual, and I like that. I like hearing that because I think that that was part of my objective when I wrote it. So that if you're approaching this book, you might not want to have some preconceived ideas about what a book by an Indigenous woman about an Indigenous woman is going to necessarily look like. And I've had other people who dislike it. and I'm just guessing at those reasons. But, I think somewhere in the book, Ruby says, oh, she's talking about being a mother, and she says something about being it takes 1,000 good to outdo one bad. And it feels like that sometimes when you get criticized about your book. It's like your baby and your little, special creation. And it's like somebody saying it smells bad because it has a dirty diaper or whatever.
And then that looms so large, right?
Yeah. So,
Lisa, when you said it was part of your intent to create something different with this story, with Ruby's story, can you elaborate a bit more about kind of what was in the back of your mind about that?
Mm-hmm. I was just listening this morning to Billy Ray Belcourt talk about, he was talking about Indigenous art and politics and how they are sort of, I don't even want to use the word inevitable, but I'm going to, inevitably connected because of our colonial history and background in this country and the, sort of the systemic issues that exist and those systems and those structures that they still exist, right? Like this whole country is built on those colonial, models and systems. So, in listening to Billy Ray talk about that, it really reminded me of a time early in my writing career where I went to Banff to the Indigenous, I forget what they call it. It was like a writing program for Indigenous writers who were probably fairly early in their writing careers. Mm-hmm. And so it was a wonderful program. It was really fantastic. I don't know if they still run it, but if they don't, they should. Mm-hmm. anyways, I went to this program, and so we did a lot of things together as a group. We really developed as writers and in our understanding about what it means to be an Indigenous writer. And so one of the questions that was posed in that program was, in what ways, like, is your writing resistance, or, you know, how are you embodying resistance in your writing? And so when I was listening to Billy Ray's, you know, it's on YouTube, it's a speech that he did, I was really reminded of that question and the way that I had to grapple with that and think it through. And it's my inclination to, you know, build my politics into my work. And it's in the editing process that I get told, whoa, you know, too much, like you're coming off like an encyclopedia, or, you know, really didactic, or whatever it is. And so I have to, you know, pull back all the time on that. But I mean, it gets on the page in that first draft, which it has to, right? You can't have your internal editor on like that all the time when you're just trying to get stuff down. So where am I headed with this? I'm headed towards why I picked this way of doing it, and I wanted to be different. Okay. So, you know, in looking at Ruby sort of moving through this world, right, in her day-to-day, in the mundane, in the relationships, in the, I heard Billy Ray Belcourt call it the living instant, which I thought was, you know, wonderful little phrase. She's doing that, but she's navigating these colonial systems and structures. And she's also, you know, sort of propped up, as much as she knows or doesn't know it, because she doesn't really for much of the book. She's really, that's her history, right? So you see the history of her grandparents, and you see her Mosham in residential school, and you see, you know, her father living his life, and you see these various aspects, and her Kukum, or grandmother, and so you understand that history because it's real. But I wanted the reader to read Ruby as a person first. And I wanted those aspects of our collective Indigenous history in this country to be there. I don't want to say in the background, but to, you know, to have that opportunity to sort of gather steam as you read the book and become more kind of evident to the reader, and even to be a thing that resonates afterwards, that, you know, you've had Ruby full on, like, go, Ruby's like just on the go. But in the background, there's all of this history and this difficult, you know, the hard history that I'm hoping just sort of resonates afterwards, and people think, oh yes, that was Ruby's story as well.
Right. It did, the way those other stories, like you say, they weave in the stories from before her and the stories that are happening outside of her understanding at that point. For people who haven't had a chance to read it yet, we should say that probably Ruby, in essence, tells the story of a young woman who's given up. She's a Métis Indigenous woman, and she's given up for adoption as a baby, and raised by people who are not Indigenous, and spends the book really trying to create kinship, trying to find connections, trying to make that connection with her past. And Ruby is, you mentioned full on Ruby. Ruby is full on. What a character, Lisa. She's bold, she's vulnerable, she has a smile that lights up the room, and a laugh that recurs again and again, and a laugh that is really, really significant in a lot of ways. Can you tell us about Ruby, I guess, where she started for you, and we can go from there?
Sure, yes. Wow. So yeah, in 2016, I published my poetry book. And then I knew, you know, as I was finishing that project up, that what I wanted to do next was write more fiction. And so I was sort of struggling with, what was I going to write? What would I write about? I said at one point to my spouse, I don't know if I have any fiction left. Like I just didn't know where to go with that for myself. So I just started writing that cliched writing advice about write what you know. So it's like, okay, I'm going to write being adopted and being Indigenous, and I'm going to write it, in these variety of ways and from these variety of perspectives. And so that's what got my curiosity and my interest and my, that part where you're really excited about a project and you want to do it, was to be able to write, different perspectives than were my own. So, I mean, I'm Indigenous, I'm adopted. I have this particular experience or set of experiences, and I wanted to be able to also write outside of that and to be able to, think about it in other ways that other people had thought about it. So I started writing these snippets, these anecdotes. Sometimes a short story would pop out, just trying to get stuff down on paper, going around all the time, having a notebook so I could jot down little scenes or little, thoughts that I was having. And so then I started to build what I thought was a short story collection. And as I got, I sort of got this critical mass of, material. And then one day I read it through and I thought, this is a terrible short story collection, because all of these female characters sound like the same, except they had different details, right? Like one would be, whatever age, and one something else, or one would have these characteristics or whatever. So, so I was feeling like, I failed at this short story collection. And then I realized, okay, no, really, I'm writing about one character, obviously. And then that character, became Ruby. And it took me quite a while to get Ruby kind of nailed down as a character and really solidified. So, there were a lot of things early on in the drafts where, it didn't end up being Ruby because it wasn't working. It wasn't fitting. It wasn't really her. And then at some point I was fairly far in, and at some point I got Ruby's laugh. And as soon as I got Ruby's laugh, it was like Ruby just coalesced for me as a character, for one thing. Plus, it allowed Ruby to just almost propel herself forward. And she was able to do all of those things that Ruby, all of those, be as wild and whatever as Ruby wanted to be or needed to be within the story. So it really just opened that up for me and made it work.
The laugh is amazing. Lisa, what do you think of that laugh? Like what does it give Ruby having that laugh?
One thing about the laugh, I wish I could replicate, I wish I could do it, because it's in my head. I know what it sounds like, and I wish I could, do it. And we had, I'll get to the question in a second, but we had a whole thing with the audiobook where there were Indigenous actors sort of auditioning for the audiobook, and I was able to participate in that through my publisher, which was really a wonderful experience as well. But in those auditions, it was hard, like, and I was asked to give like some direction or whatever. It's like, do you think that the person, doing Ruby's voice sounds like Ruby as you would hear her? And should this actor be trying to do Ruby's laugh, or how should we approach that? And so I had a variety of experiences of people trying to do the laugh, or people trying to sort of incorporate it in a different way, like where you would say her line with a laugh in your voice and then say, and she laughed, or whatever. So it was really super interesting to really think about that laugh so much. But I couldn't do it for you if you asked me. And
my next question.
The audiobook does not end up, incorporating the laugh either. It's more, laugh while you say it and then say, and she laughed, her big laugh or whatever. Okay, so I know the question. What does the laugh do for Ruby? The laugh is, it's like a tool for Ruby, right? To say, I'll show you who I am. and she just belts it out and then, goes and does something wild or whatever. But it's also, it's covering up a lot of hurt, right? Like she's quite vulnerable and she has a lot of emotional pain and whatever, but she's just, that laugh covers it up for her. But it's also very genuine. Like she's also using it in a way that's very real and conveying her, her emotions and her feelings. And as much as it's a tool for Ruby, it's a tool for me as well. Right. Or it was a tool for me.
I love how she can moderate it too. She's very conscious of what degree of laugh any particular situation is going to get sometimes.
Yeah, there was also a point in the editing where we cut out about half the laughs in the book. My editor was like, too much, it's good, but not so much. So yeah, half of those laughs left the book.
You mentioned her being wild, and Ruby is quite wild and sometimes self-destructive and very worrisome to read about sometimes. She's also filled with this beautiful curiosity and capacity for observation and compassion. The two things, or the whole ball. She's so vivid, Lisa, I guess is what I'm saying. And her curiosity is another thing I think that really propels her through the story.
I just missed the last little bit where you said she's so, I'm wearing AirPods and they're just, I don't know why they're so glitchy, but I'm sorry.
Let me say that again. I was just saying that she's so vivid. She's so filled out and vivid as a character. And then I was saying that her curiosity, I think, is another thing that really propels her, that really pulls her through life or pushes her through life.
Yeah. I just, I think about Ruby even now as somewhere on her own trajectory. Like it's very much like, okay, so I had to release this book to the world and not think about what people were going to do with it. Like it's out of my hands if people want to read it a certain way or whatever. And I always really like reading to an audience because I believe it sets potentially a different tone than what they were necessarily reading the book themselves as. So, when I talked before about people approaching the book and there might be a way that they're thinking they're going to see a book about an Indigenous woman, by an Indigenous woman take place. And I don't think this book fits that mold, but if it's hard to get out of thinking that's how you're reading it, it might look different. So I don't know if I'm being clear, but when I think about, so there's, Ruby is very sexually open, like she just does. Ruby, there's, and in everything about Ruby, there's no apology, right?
Right.
Ruby is Ruby. And so I just wonder sometimes if I worried actually about that first chapter that it would be interpreted that Ruby was somehow a victim or somehow like sexually being abused, taken advantage. Yeah. And I tried really hard to make it clear that this is Ruby's agency, this is Ruby's choice of what's happening with her and about her and all of that. So I just worry sometimes that that's not going to come through to readers. So that's what I say that's what I mean when I say I have to put the book out there, and how people read it is out of my hands. But I hope I can still hope that people will be able to come to the book and think about the fact that it is full of playfulness and it's full of humor. And as Indigenous people, humor is like so important to us as well. And humor can be a coping mechanism. Humor can be what we do, because you have to have joy and you have to have hope. And there's the hard truths, and then there's the hope that you have to navigate as well. And so Ruby is, I think, consistently trying to navigate that hope.
Yes, and consistently, yes, buoyant in an amazing way, considering the things that come at her. Can you talk a little bit about this, Lisa, about the effect of the adoption, Ruby's adoption, and the fact that she loses that connection with the family that she so longs to reconnect with? Can you talk a little bit about, I guess, writing that and being with that? And it's so close to your own experience in some ways.
Yeah, so I think, very much central to the book is this desire that Ruby has to connect with her family, but not just her family, her culture, her roots, her where she comes from. And the other piece of that is, she's at the same time bound up in this colonial system whose intention is to keep her from having her biggest desire, so yeah, one of the things that Ruby does, there are many things that are sort of affecting Ruby's life that are all sort of connected back to this idea of who am I, where do I come from? I miss that, I long for that, whatever that however you frame that. So one of them is she has her boys, she has these two boys, and she realizes that in having kids now, and she doesn't know those things that she longed for, she feels like she's passed that on to her kids, like that longing, that unknowing, that amnesia of, something that she should know, but she doesn't, kind of thing. So she goes out and she buys all of these like pictures, prints, whatever, from different thrift shops and different places, and has them, frames them and puts them on her wall, and she calls them her family photos. And she takes her kids, kind of around the room with these family photos, and she says, this is your mushum, and he would love you very much, and he would tell you this if he was here, and this is your cookum, and she, she's this, and this is your uncle, and this is your auntie, and these are your cousins, and they would have so much fun with you if you could see your cousins. So I mean, she's got this whole fabricated extended family that she at least wants her boys to feel a part of. And then I think that when she finally does connect with her family, that's a really important moment for her, because she's finally able to, take down one of those family photos, those so-called family photos, and put up an actual photo of, and it's the first time she's able to say a truth to her kids or herself about these family photos.
She's telling stories about, even early on, I think when she's out with Bart, I think it was her early boyfriend, and she tells him this whole imagined story she has about how her birth mother gave birth to her. And again, it's like you say, she just weaves these fictions, these stories around her life, just, I guess, in that desire to make a background, to make a backstory and a connection.
Yeah, and I just, when you say that, it makes me think of, so yes, she's doing that as a younger person, and then when she knows, it's like there's one moment where somebody tells her something, other piece of information that she's never heard before, and all she can do is laugh, because she realizes, I'm never going to know all there is to know. Like, I'm never going to understand this in its entirety. And it's more like this little bit here and this little bit here. And then there's sort of that image of her building her nest of mythology, where it's like one little twig and one little, piece of lint and one little whatever at a time. And that's so much what it's actually like to be, adopted and Indigenous, and have these experiences of meeting your family and understanding your community and where you come from, but only in these partial ways, and learning your story, bit by bit, and not in any sort of chronology. So, there's just very random, and I mean, there's an experience, I think, and it's for myself, but I would say it's for other people too, as an Indigenous adoptee, where I learned these things about my background and my family, and my story in my head was this, and this. So I linearized the story as best I could. But then I learned these things,
Right.
and it messes with the story I already knew or thought I knew. So then I have to go back and, just try to insert where I can. And sometimes, it's a bit overwhelming, because you might even get a piece of information, and in the moment you're like, what? Wow. And you actually almost like forget it when you go later on to think about your story, because it's just been so, I don't even know how to describe it, like just so, it's just so out of order,
Right. And then sometimes you just fall in love with your own story, and it's better than what you find out too.
Yeah, exactly. I'm working on some memoirish stuff right now, and I'm sort of trying to explore that a little bit, that idea of, what would it be like if this person was still alive, and I met them in my life. It's easier for them to be perfect right now,
Right.
because I will never have to be disappointed by them, or or see that they are, have flaws or whatever.
Lisa, did you know growing up much about the fact that you'd been adopted, or what your birth family's culture was?
I knew that I was adopted. It was not really discussed. It was more of a tread lightly kind of thing. So, and I hate to say things that are, I don't want to say things that are can be perceived as sort of being disparaging or mean or whatever. And that's one of the reasons I'm having such a hard time with this memoir, and I'm so terrified about doing it, because I don't want to. And there's a way, I'm sure there's a way to not, talk about people in my life who raised me, or in other ways, right? But I think there was very much a feeling of guilt of even wanting to know, because then the implication was, I'm saying that where I am right now, you're not good enough, or, you're a bad parent, or you're, and whatever the truth or not truth about any of those judgments would be, it was still sort of just oppressively unavailable to me in that way.
Yeah, I think you put some of those words into Ruby's mom, her adoptive mom. Am I not good enough? Yeah.
Yeah.
When you talked about finding things out randomly, it occurs to me that the structure of this novel, where things happen in no chronological order, like you mentioned earlier too, that's part of this, like you say, weaving a story together after the fact and finding bits and pieces and seeing where they all fit in. Did you know from the first that it was going to be a novel that had that quite interesting trajectory or organization? Well, after you decided it was a novel.
Yeah. I don't think I knew from the first, but I definitely knew that. So this book has had I'm just gonna give you a little background here, and then I'm gonna come back to the story. You're probably sensing a pattern here in my answers.
Wait a minute, this is the structure.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so when I first finished this book, or thought I was finished this book, I sent it to a small publisher in Saskatchewan, Coteau Books, and it was accepted at Coteau, and an editor was assigned. So I worked with the Métis author and editor and academic Warren Carreau on the first sort of iteration of this book, and the manuscript as it was at that point. So Warren and I worked quite a bit on it together, and then Coteau Books went bankrupt, as a publisher, and the manuscript eventually reverted to me, and I was able to move forward with it, and it was picked up by Doubleday Canada. So I was very lucky in that process. And then it had a second round of edits with a brand new editor, and the book did change in that second round. But in the first round with Warren, the structure, we really did talk about that structure. And so I would say from that beginning, the structure hasn't changed in that second round, but other things did change in the second round. So the structure, we did talk quite extensively about it. We experimented with it quite a bit. I sort of left one of our meetings and went and put it all in chronological order. And then I spent like 2 days crying about it because it was awful, or in my opinion, it was awful. I couldn't live with it that way. And I thought that maybe he would think that it really needed to be like that. And I was really worried about, having to sort of fight for not doing that. But I mean, that's not at all Warren's style, and that's not how it went. So, in our discussions as well, that was probably my first point, was to bring up that idea of Ruby's memories, or a person's memories, and a person's way of narrating themselves, because we all do it. We do it all the time. We narrate our stories, we edit things in and out. I think that it's very, very much a thing that happens. So we talked about that kind of a structure, sort of replicating that idea of, you only know these bits at a time. And if you look at the book overall, you'll see that, there are parts about Ruby. So there's all these interconnecting kind of narratives that happen outside of Ruby. And there's parts about Ruby and her history that at the end, the reader knows and Ruby doesn't know. So the reader ends up knowing more than Ruby does by the end of it.
Which is really interesting.
Yeah, it makes me sometimes as a writer feel like there's more Ruby that I should write, or could write, or might write, or want to write.
I guess we should take a pause here. I'm just looking at the time and ask Jonna if there are questions for Lisa from folks who are here. Thanks to everyone who was here, by the way.
Hello, Lisa and Sheryl. I do have a question, actually. I just wanted to ask about the beautiful cover art on the copy that I've got. I did a little research and I found out it was by Callie Spitzer, and I just wondered what about that image spoke to you, and how you went about choosing that as the image for the book cover.
Yeah, so here's the cover and the artwork. It's really important to me what's on the cover of my book. And so working, with a publisher, working with the editor, working with whoever around that is sometimes I feel like, oh no, I'm not going to be listened to. And that certainly wasn't the case in this situation. So I did have sort of a few Indigenous artists in mind whose work I would have, I was interested in having on my cover, and particular images. I was drawn towards the work that was more portraiture or photography. And so somebody else brought Kelly to my attention, and, there was just such a wide variety of possibilities in her work. Her work is so beautiful and so amazingly done. And I'm not even sure how much I'm supposed to talk about the process or whatever, like as far as my publisher is concerned, but we did have a different image from Callie that we were interested in at the beginning, and I loved it, and it was beautiful, and I love this one equally, if not more. But that first image, there was an issue with it in that the model was a little bit reluctant. And so, there was reassurance that the image would be adjusted so that it wouldn't be, there wouldn't be nudity on the cover of my book or whatever, in the way that was maybe the concern. And then it came back again a second time. And what the real issue was the model wasn't Indigenous. I think the model was, I can't remember, sort of I don't know. But the model not being Indigenous. And so, I sort of had to have a little cry, because it was like, I love that image, and I love the way it's been, somebody had already graphically sort of worked it onto a design for the cover. And so I had to give that up. And we went back, and, there were lots of people at that point sort of looking at Kelly's work and trying to sort of find the right image and the right part. And so this is the image that we came up with that's really beautiful. Like, it's very evocative of Indigenous women. It really sort of speaks to that care and that tenderness for Ruby, that I felt, and that is important to me within the book. So yeah, that's kind of the interesting trajectory of this particular cover. I have another cover coming out in the US. So Hogarth Press has picked up the book in the US, and it'll launch in April. And so it gets a new cover, it gets a US cover. So that's been a whole other process, which has been a ton of fun and really interesting to go through as well.
It's so intriguing to me that the difference, that publishers think this cover will work in this country, this in another country. This cover, the Canadian cover that we're seeing here, for people who haven't seen it, shows two women braiding each other's hair, and you can see their hands, and hands come up so much in this story too. And Ruby really looks at people's hands and the beauty of their hands. So I just thought that was a really interesting connection with this image too, Lisa. Why is she so intrigued with hands, do you think?
That's such a good question. I don't know, because there were a couple times where I had to cut the hands out because it was like too much, like too many different people. Hands. Yeah. So I don't know. She really notices that, I think it's Bart, and then I can't remember. I feel like maybe it's not Ruby. I think, isn't it the Ruby's birth mother, Grace, that notices her boyfriend's hands or something?
Maybe that's it. I just noticed. Yeah. As somebody who notices hands myself a lot, it really just resonated with me. The other thing I wanted to ask you about is, I can't hold this up because it'll just go all blurry, but inside the front cover, there is Ruby's relationship web. It's like a bit of a mapping situation there with lines and names and everything. I'm
going to try holding it up, because I have
That's better.
I have a bigger color copy. So
perfect.
I don't know if people
all the names that are there, and the lines and the different kinds of lines. Can you explain a bit about what this means to you? So when I don't know if people realize how hard it is to write a book, but it's really hard. So there's a lot of different aspects that, you have to keep straight. And, I'd wake up in a cold sweat and think, that can't happen, or, wrong time, or wrong person, or, whatever it was. So many things, like, holy cow, so many things, even right to the last copy edit, where you're thinking this doesn't fit, or but anyways, and it's been looked at by a million people. But so the relationship web was something I just drew. Not this one. This one was produced. My son did a piece of art that is this. That's very textural. Like, I don't know, in the color copy you might see the green. The green is yarn. Oh yeah. Okay.
And the brown is like pieces of paper, and so there's different aspects to that in the actual piece, but I know in the book it's just sort of in black and white. But when I drew that for myself, I just had a little stick Ruby in the middle, and I started to map out this relationship web. And at some point with the publisher, I just shared it, randomly, not really meaning for it to be part of the book. And the publisher said, oh no, let's put this in. And then I said, okay, well then let me take it away. You can't put my little stick figure in there. I've gotta take it away and get somebody else to try and, develop something with it. So my son did this piece of art over a period of time and got that relationship web going. So it was important to me organizationally, but it was also important to me, I sort of sat down, I was talking with Warren Carreau about it, and about the images and about the importance of her relationships with the different characters in the book. So characters who are her family, but not just her family, right? Her relations and her whole, world, that she's connected to. And we talked about the Cree concept of Wakotowin, which is relatedness, and how, there's this relatedness and interrelatedness between all of us, and even broader than the concept is broader than that. So we both sort of came to really like the idea of including this relationship web, as that conceptually, that Wakotowin for Ruby that she's longed for, for so long. So yeah.
How wonderful that your son did the illustration for that then too.
Yeah, I have a bunch of artistic kids.
I wonder why. Lisa, there's a line, there's so many, I've made all kinds of notes on this page here about lines that I wanted to mention. And one that jumps out at me right now is when you just think about that web and belonging, is that feeling that Ruby has of being awkward in her own skin. And I think you say, after factory modifications. That's just such a great way to express that sensation, I think.
And I think that, I can only talk from my own perspective as an Indigenous person who was adopted into a non-Indigenous family and sort of lived that alter life or something. I don't even know how to describe it, but it really sort of, to me, that rings fairly true in terms of, not fitting here and not fitting there. Once a person becomes, cognizant of it and cognizant of the world that they were born into, but they no longer, necessarily fit into. Mm-hmm. And I think that as an Indigenous person, for myself, I've had to come back to who I once was, come back to who I was meant to be, come back to community, right?
And you describe Ruby as being able to identify other Indigenous adoptees, just something that makes that recognizable. Do you feel that way too, Lisa?
I think sometimes more in my adult life, I have felt like maybe that was a thing. I mean, I don't go around sort of trying to pinpoint who isn't, but sometimes there's almost a kinship there, like just in that understanding and recognizing other people who have been through a similar kind of a situation.
I think I saw a note there from Jonna saying we've got another question from someone in the audience. Jonna?
Yes, hello again. So we have a question from Barbara. Barbara says, speaking as a former small book publisher, I'm interested in your trajectory of working with a small publisher who goes bankrupt and then ending up with Doubleday. How smooth was this transition? Did you get an agent who placed your manuscript with Doubleday?
The trajectory was painful and made me cry, and yeah, it was so not pretty. It was also complicated by the fact that I was part of Coteau Books. I was, in a number of ways. My first fiction book was published by Coteau, which was actually my first book. It wasn't my first book published, but it was my first book ever accepted by a publisher. So, you know, I had this history with Coteau. I was connected to the board. Like there were just a number of ways that Coteau going big. And I mean, just even to see this prairie publisher who had been around for 45 years no longer be able to survive, it's pretty devastating to see that happen. And the people whose hearts are in that publishing house and in that publisher, and all the authors whose books, you know, were published by that. So I mean, that all of that was a devastating sort of a thing to happen. I was very, very fortunate that my book was picked up by Denise Bukowski in Toronto. So Denise is an agent. And so Denise was able to, you know, take my manuscript, work with me on various aspects of it. I mean, she knows the business, she knows writing, she knows what's good writing, she knows what needs to happen. So even though, you know, in my opinion, my book was done, in Denise's opinion, it wasn't, which is fair. And so then, you know, she did get me meetings with whoever I needed meetings with to figure that out, and to finally get it placed with Doubleday Canada, which, you know, is really fantastic. So, you know, and I would never want to think that Coteau's bad luck was my good luck, because it really wasn't. I wanted to be clear that I was devastated by Coteau going under, and the fact that my book landed where it landed, you know, is sort of it's a different story. It's aside from the fact of what happened to Coteau.
What a roller coaster.
Absolutely.
Gosh. Lisa, was Ruby always the name once you realized you were writing about one woman over different parts of life?
I think so. I'm trying to remember if there were early names. I may have had trouble with her last name, but as in my mind, Ruby's always been Ruby.
Why was that, do you think?
I couldn't even tell you, really. Yeah, I don't know. The only other Ruby that comes to mind, there was a children's book that I probably read to my kids, and it was either called, or it had a line, Ruby Lou, Brave and True. maybe that, you know, propelled, maybe that made me think about Ruby's character, like the spirit of Ruby or something. I don't know. Yeah.
Because it's such an evocative name, right? It just, to me, it brings so many things to mind about, you know, beauty and lusciousness and just that whole feeling of exuberance in a way. Also blood. I mean, there are so many things that come to mind with that.
Yeah, I think there was a moment as well. I forget which part of the book, but I get in these weird experimental moods. So I forget, I had read something where I think they had used a color or something, or maybe it was snow or the idea of whiteness or whatever. So I wanted to bring something into my book, and this is like somewhere early in those choppy pieces that I was writing, and so I wanted to have that imagery of red, right? And red is important as an Indigenous sort of motif for the idea of being Indigenous, but blood, as you say, all of those pieces. And I had written an essay called Born Red. So maybe that's where Ruby came from. I don't know. It very well, now that you're sort of jogging my my memories or my ideas, but maybe I'll just take that, and that's part of my story now. We just made that work.
I love that the title has that doubt in it too, that kind of probably Ruby. You know, it raises so many thoughts when you see that title. Yeah.
Well, and the other piece is Ruby had another name. And so it's the whole identity crisis of being adopted. You know, I don't even think it's adopted and Indigenous. I just think it's adopted, that there is quite likely another identity sitting there somewhere waiting for you to think, what? So, yeah.
Yeah. And when she finds the name that she was given at birth, it doesn't resonate with her at all. It's not. And then her birth mother is asked to come up with a fictitious name too when she goes into the place where she's to have the baby. I mean, there are so many things about names. Yeah.
And then Ruby makes up a fake name for herself and
Right.
she meets that one guy.
Yes.
So, yeah.
A very interesting name that she picks up on, but yeah.
Mhm.
So Lisa, you're working on another fiction now. Do you think you'll do more poetry again at some point too?
Yeah, I'm working on nonfiction right now. So I've got
nonfiction, right? The memoir,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, I've got a contract with Knopf Canada for this memoir. And so I also started a brand new job in June, and then this book launched at the end of August. And so I have been really busy and not writing what I should be writing. But, I feel like it's going to take me a long time. In terms of what else I will also write, I will not say, never say never, but I think that I will focus on fiction. And I loved writing my poetry book, but I was a bit exhausted and worn out by it too. Like, it was also really emotional work as well.
Yeah. Because it's a book, for people who haven't read it, it's a book that really draws a lot on your family's experiences and other people's experiences with residential schools. Yeah.
So maybe, it was difficult and it was heavy and it was emotional kind of work, but I loved working with and playing with language. But I also love when I see a poet write either a nonfiction book or a fiction book, because you can see poetry in the way they employ language in prose.
Yes.
So I think as much as I loved the language and playing with the language and the poetry, I can do that. I can execute that in my prose as well. And
it's so beautifully written, this book, Probably Ruby. It's just, it's a gem. Yeah. Thank you. Lisa, it's been a real treat to have a chance to talk to you. And I'm just looking at the time here, and I don't know if there's a bit that you'd like to read. You mentioned that you like to read. I don't know if do you have it in front of you right there?
I have it here.
I'm putting you completely on the spot here because we didn't mention.
Okay. Okay, let me go to the one that I've marked. I've just got a little section here marked, and I put a sticky note on it, and it says 2 minutes.
Okay.
So I feel like we could do that. We can
do that.
Okay, so I'm dropping you into the first chapter. I'm not even sure what to tell you, except I think we can just drop in and see it for what it is. She ordered a pint of beer and enjoyed the first cold swallow, anticipating the spread of warmth that would let her shoulders relax and eventually fill her with curiosity and cuteness. She fished out her phone to text Cal now, before she had too many drinks. 2 things she'd learned to be careful about. 1, she always lied to her counselors about drinking. Some of them had their own hang-ups about alcohol and drugs, and she didn't want any of them confusing their issues with hers. The second thing she'd learned was, don't drunk text, drunk email, drunk Facebook, and so on. Best to get any follow-up text to Cal out of her system now, pre-drink. But before she had a chance to do that, she sensed someone occupy the bar stool next to hers. Next one's on me, said a familiar voice. She closed her eyes for just a second. Dana, oh my God, she said, as if she was not at all surprised. I was literally just talking about you. He looked confused. To my counselor, she said. All good things, I'm sure, he laughed, as if they were a couple of corny business buddies out for happy hour, as if he wasn't really bad news, as if she wasn't still in love with him. Actually, I was saying how when I first met you, I wondered if your beard would give me razor burn. But then afterwards, I realized I shouldn't have worried. She laughed her spectacular laugh so he could remember what he'd been missing. When the bartender came by, Dana ordered another round. The The bartender plunked a new pint in front of Ruby. Dana said, "Big head on that one." "I don't mind a bit of head," she said, taking up her line like there had never been a break between them. "You want to get out of this place?" he asked. She diffused her laugh all over the bar. "It's going to take a lot more than 2 beers to get me out of here."
You just get such a sense of her, even from that bit, the curiosity and the humor and the boldness of Ruby. Lisa, thank you for this. Thanks for this great conversation. And I'm really appreciative of the chance to talk about this book. Thanks.
Marcy, thank you so much. It's been wonderful.
And thanks so much to the folks at VPL for making these wonderful sessions possible, and for all of you for joining us here online. It's great to have you here. And as Jonna mentioned, this will be broadcast, some of it anyway, on North by Northwest in the not too distant future.